A lonely billionaire buys a deaf girl sold by her drunk father, but what he thought was an act of mercy becomes something he'll never forget. The night he takes her home, silence fills the mansion, until she places her hand on his chest and signs, "I can hear your sadness." He thought she couldn't hear anything, but somehow she hears everything that matters. As headlines explode and the world turns against him, he learns a secret that changes everything. This girl who can't hear sound can still feel the pain buried in people's hearts. Now one broken man must protect the only person who can truly understand him, before the past tears them apart again. What happens when the deaf girl who shouldn't hear becomes the one who teaches him how to listen? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The early morning sun crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Grayson Weller's Aspen mansion, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. He stood at the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, letting the silence of another day wash over him. It was a silence he had grown used to over the past 5 years, though it had never become comfortable. Max, his golden retriever, padded softly across the kitchen floor and pressed against his leg. The dog's warm presence was one of the few constants left in Grayson's life. He reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, earning a gentle thump of tail against tile. "Just you and me again, buddy," Grayson murmured, his voice rough from disuse. His gaze drifted to the refrigerator, where colorful drawings still hung, held by alphabet magnets. Sarah's artwork, stick figures of their family, a house with a crooked chimney, a rainbow arching over mountains. He couldn't bring himself to take them down, just like he couldn't pack away the framed photo on the mantel, showing his wife Claire's radiant smile as she held their laughing 6-year-old daughter. The grand piano in the living room caught the morning light, its polished surface collecting dust. It had been Sarah's favorite spot to sit beside him while he played, her small fingers mimicking his movements on the keys. Now it stood silent, like everything else in the house. Grayson checked his phone, finding 3 missed calls from his assistant, Margaret. With a sigh, he called her back. "Mr. Weller." Margaret answered on the first ring. "I've been trying to reach you about the auction today. I haven't forgotten," he said, though he wished he could. "The foundation needs that land secured for the new music education center. The auction starts at 7 o'clock this evening in Pine Grove." Grayson pinched the bridge of his nose. "I know, Margaret. I'll be there." "It would mean a lot to the community," she added softly. Claire would have wanted, "I'll handle it." He cut her off, his tone sharp. After a pause, he added more gently, "Thank you for the reminder." After ending the call, Grayson walked to the wall of windows overlooking the mountains. 5 years ago, he and Claire had chosen this spot for their dream home, falling in love with the view of the snow-capped peaks and the way the aspens turned gold in fall. Now the vastness of the landscape only emphasized his solitude. The day passed slowly, as they all did. Grayson worked remotely, reviewing reports from his tech company and answering emails. His sound mapping software had revolutionized digital audio processing, making him wealthy beyond imagination. But success felt hollow now, with no one to share it with. As evening approached, he changed into a charcoal suit, more out of habit than necessity. Max watched him from the doorway of his bedroom, head tilted questioningly. "Sorry, boy, you have to stay here tonight," Grayson told him, scratching under the dog's chin. Max's brown eyes seemed to understand more than most humans did these days. The sun was setting as Grayson got into his black SUV, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. The mountain roads were familiar, though he rarely drove them anymore. A light dusting of snow had fallen earlier, making the world look clean and new. As he navigated the winding back roads toward Pine Grove, Grayson passed a bar on the outskirts of town. Its neon sign buzzed an angry red against the darkening sky, casting a sickly glow on the snow. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he drove past, his jaw clenching involuntarily. The police report had said the driver who killed Claire and Sarah had just left a bar like that one, 3 times over the legal limit. Walked away without a scratch while Grayson's family... He forced the thought away, focusing on the road ahead. The auction house wasn't far now. Just another business transaction, he told himself. Get in, secure the land, get out. Then back to his quiet house, back to his routine, back to the silence that had become both his prison and his shield. But something about that neon-lit bar stuck in his mind as he drove, like a splinter he couldn't quite dig out. He didn't know it yet, but that garish sign marked the beginning of a change in his carefully ordered world. A change that would start tonight, in a small-town auction house, where fate had something very different planned than a simple real estate transaction. The snow started falling again as he pulled into the parking lot of the Pine Grove Community Center. Through the windows, he could see people gathering inside, their voices muffled but animated. Grayson sat in his car for a moment, gathering his resolve. Then he stepped out into the cold evening air, leaving footprints in the fresh snow as he walked towards the entrance. The warm light spilling from the windows seemed to beckon him forward, though he couldn't have known then that he was walking toward more than just a land purchase. He was walking toward a future he never could have imagined. In the growing darkness, the neon sign of the bar still glowed in the distance, a reminder of all he had lost. But ahead of him, though he didn't know it yet, waited something he had thought was forever beyond his reach, a chance at healing, at hope, at finding his way back to life again. Grayson wasn't sure what made him pull into the bar's gravel parking lot. Perhaps it was the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, or maybe it was simple curiosity about the place that seemed to mock everything he'd lost. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting red shadows across the hood of his black SUV. He sat there for several long moments, engine idling. Through the frosted windows, he could see shadowy figures moving inside, hear the muffled thump of country music. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He shouldn't go in. He had no business being here. But something drew him forward. The smell hit him first when he pushed open the heavy wooden door, stale beer and cigarette smoke, despite Colorado's indoor smoking ban. A handful of patrons hunched over the bar like tired question marks, while others clustered around scattered tables. In one corner, an old jukebox played Merle Haggard to nobody in particular. That's when he saw her. A young girl sat alone in the corner, maybe 13 years old, with long dark hair falling around her face like a curtain. She wore a faded blue sweater that seemed too thin for the mountain cold, and her hands were pressed tightly against her ears. Something about her posture spoke of practiced invisibility. Near the bar, a man swayed on his feet, his voice carrying above the music. "Another!" he demanded, slamming his empty glass down. The bartender hesitated. "Think you've had enough, Dale," the bartender said, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "I'll tell you when I've had enough." The man, Dale, growled. His bloodshot eyes darted around the room before landing on the girl in the corner. "Need money for another bottle. That's all she's good for anyway." Grayson's stomach turned as he realized the man was talking about the girl. Her father, he assumed, though the thought made him sick. "Can't even hear a word I say," Dale continued, his words slurring together. "Born broken. What good's a kid who can't hear?" A few patrons chuckled nervously, while others looked away, embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. The girl hadn't moved, but Grayson could see her shoulders trembling. "Hell," Dale announced to the room, spreading his arms wide. "I'll sell her for a bottle. Any takers?" He laughed crudely, swaying on his feet. The words hit Grayson like a physical blow. Without conscious thought, he found himself stepping forward, rage and protection warring in his chest. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a thick roll of bills he'd brought for the auction. "I'll take her," he said, his voice cutting through the smoky air like a blade. The bar went silent. Even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath between songs. Dale turned slowly, sizing up Grayson with bleary eyes that suddenly showed a spark of cunning. "Well, well," Dale drawled. "Looks like we got ourselves a real gentleman here." He stumbled forward, reaching for the money. "How much you offering?" Grayson held the roll of bills just out of reach. "First, I want something in writing. A legal transfer of guardianship." Dale barked out a laugh. "Fancy man wants paperwork, does he?" He turned to the bartender. "Got something to write on?" The bartender, looking deeply uncomfortable, slid a cocktail napkin across the bar. Dale snatched it, along with a pen someone offered. His handwriting was barely legible as he scrawled across the paper, but the intent was clear enough. He was signing away his daughter's care to a stranger for drinking money. The girl had finally lowered her hands, watching the scene with wide, frightened eyes. Grayson couldn't tell if she could read lips or understand what was happening, but the fear on her face was universal. He took the napkin, checked the signature, then slowly counted out $5,000 onto the bar. It was far more than he'd needed to offer, but he wanted to be sure Dale wouldn't follow them. The man's eyes lit up at the sight of the money. "She's all yours," Dale said, already reaching for the cash. "No refunds." He laughed at his own joke, but Grayson was already moving toward the girl. He approached her slowly, careful to stay in her line of sight. When he reached her table, he crouched down so they were at eye level. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, filled with equal parts fear and hope. "You're safe now," he said clearly, making sure she could see his lips. He didn't know if she could understand him, but he hoped she could read the sincerity in his expression. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded slightly. Grayson stood and offered his hand. She took it, her small fingers cold against his palm, and rose from her chair. Together they walked towards the door, leaving behind the smoke and the laughter and the man who had sold his daughter for whiskey money. Outside, the snow was falling harder now. Grayson led her to his SUV, opening the passenger door for her. She slid in without hesitation. Perhaps any destination seemed better than the one she was leaving. He got in on the driver's side and started the engine, the headlights cutting bright paths through the swirling snow. As they pulled away from the bar, Grayson glanced in his rear-view mirror. Through the falling snow, he could see Dale silhouetted in the doorway, counting his money. The sight made his jaw clench. He looked over at the girl, who sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. The headlights carved through the darkness like a promise as they made their way up the mountain road. Snow swirled in their beams, creating the illusion of stars streaming past. The girl watched the flakes with quiet fascination, and Grayson wondered when she'd last felt truly safe. They drove in silence, though he supposed silence meant something different to her, as the storm intensified around them. The windshield wipers kept steady time, pushing away the snow that threatened to obscure their path. With each mile that passed between them and the bar, Grayson could see the girl's shoulders relaxing slightly, though her hands remained tightly clasped in her lap. The road wound higher into the mountains, the familiar turns leading them closer to his home. He wasn't sure what he would do next, how he would help this child he'd essentially purchased in a moment of moral outrage. But as they climbed above the storm clouds and the stars began to peek through, He knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. The mansion's circular driveway crunched with fresh snow as Grayson's SUV pulled up to the grand entrance. The clock on his dashboard read 12:45 in the morning. Next to him, the girl, Ellie, he'd learned from the crude paperwork, huddled in her seat, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest. The toy had clearly seen better days, with one ear partially detached and patches of fur worn smooth by years of loving. Motion-activated lights illuminated the stone facade of the house, casting long shadows across the snow. Ellie's eyes widened as she took in the massive structure, her grip tightening on her rabbit. Grayson noticed her shivering. Her thin jacket offered little protection against the mountain cold. "Let's get you inside where it's warm," he said clearly, making sure she could see his face in the dim light. She nodded, her movements small and hesitant. As they approached the front door, Grayson saw a light flick on inside. Mrs. Doyle would still be up, waiting for his return, as she always did. He hadn't called ahead to warn her about their unexpected guest. There hadn't been time, and honestly, he wasn't sure what he would have said. The heavy wooden door swung open before they reached it. Mrs. Doyle stood in the doorway, her silver hair neatly pinned back despite the late hour, wearing her usual cardigan over a sensible dress. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of them. Grayson in his expensive coat, and beside him, a trembling girl in threadbare clothes. "Good Lord, Mr. Weller," Mrs. Doyle gasped, one hand flying to her throat. "Who's this?" Ellie shrank back slightly at Mrs. Doyle's sudden appearance, positioning herself partially behind Grayson. The movement wasn't lost on either adult. She needed help, Grayson said simply, ushering Ellie inside. "I'll explain more later, but right now she needs a warm bed and clean clothes." Mrs. Doyle's expression softened as she got a better look at Ellie. Years of experience had taught her when to ask questions and when to simply act. This was clearly a moment for action. Of course," she said, already moving towards the stairs. "I'll prepare the blue guest room. It's right across from mine." She paused, looking back at Ellie with gentle eyes. "Would you like some hot chocolate, dear?" Ellie looked up at Grayson questioningly. He nodded encouragingly, and she gave Mrs. Doyle a tiny nod in response. "I need to make some calls," Grayson said, pulling out his phone. "My lawyer needs to be notified immediately." While Mrs. Doyle led Ellie upstairs, Grayson stepped into his study. The room was dark, except for the soft glow of his desk lamp, which he always left on when he was out. He dialed James Morton's private number, knowing his lawyer would answer despite the hour. It was part of why he paid him so well. "Grayson?" James answered on the second ring, sounding surprisingly alert. "What's wrong?" Grayson explained the situation in precise terms. The bar, the drunk father, the impromptu guardianship agreement on a cocktail napkin. James listened without interrupting, though Grayson could hear him typing notes. "I need to know what legal protections we can put in place immediately," Grayson concluded. "At least until we can contact social services and ensure she's placed somewhere safe." "I'll start the paperwork now," James assured him. "That napkin might not be legally binding, but given the circumstances and your resources, we can get emergency temporary guardianship approved quickly. I'll have documents for you to sign first thing in the morning." While Grayson handled the legal matters, Ellie was cautiously exploring her new surroundings. Mrs. Doyle had shown her to a beautiful room with pale blue walls and a queen-sized bed that looked bigger than any she'd ever seen. A steaming mug of hot chocolate waited on the bedside table, and Mrs. Doyle had promised to find her some clean pajamas. Left alone for a moment, Ellie ventured out into the hallway. The house was huge, with long corridors and high ceilings that made her feel very small. Her bare feet moved silently across the hardwood floors. She'd left her worn sneakers by the front door as instructed. She found herself drawn to a partially open door through which she could see the gleam of polished wood in the moonlight. It was a music room, dominated by a magnificent grand piano. Other instruments hung on the walls or sat in stands, violins, guitars, even what looked like an old cello. Ellie stood in the doorway, not daring to enter, but her foot moved of its own accord, pressing against the floor. She could feel it, the subtle vibrations of the house settling, the distant hum of heating vents, the way sound moved through the space. She'd learned long ago that even if her ears didn't work properly, the world was full of music you could feel. Grayson found her there, still standing in the doorway. He watched as she tapped her foot gently against the floor, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could perceive. The sight stirred something in his chest, a memory of another little girl who used to dance to music only she could hear. Mrs. Doyle appeared with an armful of soft clothes. "Here we are, dear. These might be a bit big, but they'll do for tonight. And I've put fresh towels in your bathroom if you'd like to wash up." Before following Mrs. Doyle back to her room, Ellie noticed a notepad and pen on a small table near the door. She picked them up, scribbled something quickly, and held it up for Grayson to read. "Thank you," the note said in careful handwriting. "I can hear a little if I touch things." Grayson nodded, understanding dawning. He'd read about this, how some hearing-impaired people could perceive sound through vibration. It explained her fascination with the music room, her foot tapping, the way she seemed to sense things around her. Mrs. Doyle guided Ellie back to the blue room, chattering comfortingly even though she wasn't sure how much the girl could hear. But her warm presence seemed to help. And by the time she had Ellie settled with clean pajamas and fresh bedding, some of the fear had left the girl's eyes. Grayson left the notepad with Ellie, placing it on her bedside table next to the now empty hot chocolate mug. She sat cross-legged on the bed, her stuffed rabbit in her lap, looking simultaneously exhausted and too wary to sleep. "You're safe here," Grayson said again, making sure she could see his face in the soft lamplight. "Mrs. Doyle is right across the hall if you need anything during the night." Ellie nodded, her fingers absently stroking her rabbit's worn ear. The gesture reminded him so strongly of his daughter that he had to look away for a moment. Mrs. Doyle shooed him out gently, promising to stay with Ellie until she fell asleep. As Grayson headed to his own room, he could hear Mrs. Doyle's soothing voice floating down the hallway, speaking softly to Ellie about breakfast plans and how they would need to go shopping tomorrow for proper clothes. In his room, Grayson stood at the window, watching the snow continue to fall. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind. Emergency temporary guardianship. Temporary. He told himself that was for the best. He wasn't equipped to care for a child, especially not one with special needs. He would make sure she was placed somewhere safe, somewhere she could get proper care and support. But as he prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the image of her standing in the music room doorway, feeling for sounds she couldn't quite hear, clutching that old rabbit like it was her only friend in the world. Sometimes, he thought, the heart makes decisions before the mind has a chance to object. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the mansion's polished floors. Grayson woke earlier than usual, his mind still processing the previous night's events. As he made his way downstairs, the familiar silence of his home felt different somehow. Expectant, almost alive with possibility, he paused at the sound of movement from the music room. The door stood partially open, and through the gap he saw Ellie. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the grand piano, her small hand pressed flat against its wooden base. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced around her like tiny stars. For a moment he simply watched. Her face held an expression of deep concentration, head slightly tilted, as if she were listening to something far away. The sight tugged at his heart, reminding him of mornings long ago when another little girl would sneak into this room to play. Grayson stepped inside, his footfalls quiet on the hardwood floor. Ellie didn't startle at his approach. She must have felt the vibrations of his steps. She looked up at him with those large, questioning eyes, but didn't move her hand from the piano. Making a decision, Grayson settled onto the piano bench. His fingers hovering over the keys, he glanced at Ellie, who watched him with curious anticipation. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed a single key, middle C. The note rang out, pure and clear. Ellie's face transformed. Her eyes widened, and a smile bloomed across her features, the first real smile he'd seen since bringing her home. Her free hand moved in a fluid gesture, fingers splayed near her face, then flowing outward like a flower opening. "Beautiful," she signed. Grayson's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected her to know sign language, though it made sense. More surprising was how that simple gesture affected him, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. "You can feel the music?" he asked, speaking slowly while facing her so she could read his lips. Ellie nodded enthusiastically. She patted the piano's wooden surface, then pressed her other hand to her chest. The message was clear. She felt the vibrations in both places. Mrs. Doyle's voice carried from the doorway. "Breakfast is ready, dears. Can't start the day on empty stomachs." In the bright kitchen, Mrs. Doyle had outdone herself. The table held a feast of scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, fresh toast, and a bowl of mixed berries. Ellie's eyes grew wide at the spread, but she hesitated before sitting down. Grayson pulled out a chair for her, noting how she perched on its edge as if ready to flee. She watched him and Mrs. Doyle carefully before picking up her fork, mimicking their movements with careful precision. Her first bite of eggs was tentative, but her face lit up at the taste. Mrs. Doyle beamed, clearly pleased. "Poor lamb looks like she hasn't had a proper meal in ages," she murmured to Grayson. Ellie ate slowly, savoring each bite as if afraid it might disappear. The quiet that settled over the kitchen wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt natural, peaceful even. Grayson found himself appreciating how Ellie didn't feel the need to fill the silence with chatter. Her presence was like a gentle note held in the air, neither demanding nor intrusive. Mrs. Doyle moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, occasionally stopping to pat Ellie's shoulder or refill her glass of orange juice. The girl seemed to bloom under the attention, though she still startled slightly at unexpected touches. After breakfast, Grayson retreated to his study. He had calls to make, starting with Dr. Sarah Chen, a highly recommended child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. As he explained the situation, he found himself becoming protective, emphasizing Ellie's need for gentle handling. "I'd like to evaluate her as soon as possible," Dr. Chen said. "Children in these situations often need immediate support." Next, he contacted a sign language instructor recommended by his lawyer. Ms. Rebecca Torres had experience working with deaf and partially deaf children and could start lessons the following week. Throughout the morning, he could hear Mrs. Doyle's warm voice floating through the house as she showed Ellie around, explaining where things were, establishing gentle routines. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of them. Mrs. Doyle demonstrating how to work the television remote, Ellie helping to make the bed in her room, both of them sorting through some old clothes Mrs. Doyle had found in storage. As evening approached, snow began falling again, thick flakes drifting past the windows like feathers. Grayson found Ellie curled up in a window seat in the library, a sketchbook balanced on her knees. Mrs. Doyle had found it among some old art supplies, along with a set of colored pencils. He watched as her small hand moved across the paper with surprising confidence. She was drawing two figures, a tall man and a small girl, surrounded by swirling lines that he recognized as musical notes. The care she took with each stroke, the way she would pause to study her work before continuing, reminded him painfully of his daughter's artistic focus. The scene captured something both hopeful and fragile, like the snow outside, beautiful but temporary. Grayson pushed away thoughts of what would happen when social services eventually got involved. For now, in this moment, there was just the quiet scratch of pencil on paper, the soft glow of lamplight, and the feeling that perhaps silence wasn't always empty. Ellie looked up, catching him watching. Instead of shrinking away, she held up the drawing, a question in her eyes. Grayson moved closer, studying the artwork. The musical notes seemed to dance around the figures, connecting them, creating a visible representation of something invisible but deeply felt. He smiled and signed "beautiful," the one word of sign language he'd learned today. Ellie's answering smile lit up her whole face, and she quickly added more musical notes to the drawing, making them spiral up towards the paper's edge like a melody taking flight. The January days flowed like a gentle stream, each one bringing small but meaningful changes to the mansion above Aspen. Mornings began with Ellie joining Mrs. Doyle in the kitchen, helping to mix pancake batter or crack eggs into bowls. Her movements grew more confident as she learned the layout of her new home, though she still carried her stuffed rabbit everywhere. Grayson found himself drawn into their quiet routines. One morning, he showed Ellie how to make hot cocoa the way his daughter had loved it, with real chocolate melted slowly into warm milk, topped with tiny marshmallows that dissolved into sweet clouds. Ellie's face lit up at the first sip, and she carefully wrote in her notebook, "Tastes like happiness." The greenhouse became their special project. Mrs. Doyle had mentioned wanting an herb garden, and Grayson remembered enough from his wife's gardening days to guide Ellie's small hands as they pressed basil and thyme seeds into rich soil. Ellie seemed fascinated by the warm, humid air inside the glass walls, pressing her palms against the windows to feel the vibration of rain on the panes. 3 times a week, Rebecca Torres, the sign language instructor, visited for lessons. Ellie proved to be a quick study, her expressive hands eager to learn this new language. Grayson found himself sitting in on these sessions, practicing basic signs in the evenings. Even Mrs. Doyle joined in, though she sometimes mixed up "thank you" with "turkey," making Ellie giggle silently. The peace shattered on a Tuesday morning. Grayson's phone buzzed with urgent messages from his assistant, Marcus. "Turn on the news now," read the first text. With growing dread, Grayson switched on the television in his study. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Tech billionaire buys deaf girl in bar deal." The story spread like wildfire, each outlet putting their own sensational spin on it. Some painted him as a savior, others hinted at darker motives. Photos of Ellie, clearly taken with long-range lenses, appeared online, showing her in the greenhouse, walking with Mrs. Doyle to the car, standing at the mansion's windows. Marcus arrived within the hour, his usual calm demeanor cracking. "This is a PR nightmare, Grayson. We need to get ahead of this story. The board is concerned about the company's image. People are asking questions about legal guardianship, about your intentions. I don't care about the company's image." Grayson cut him off, his voice sharp. "That child's safety is what matters." Mrs. Doyle appeared in the doorway, her face tight with worry. "There are reporters at the gate, Mr. Weller. Some tried to climb over. Security turned them back, but—" She wrung her hands in her apron. "The poor girl is frightened. She can feel all the commotion through the floor vibrations." Grayson's jaw clenched. He'd meant to protect Ellie, not expose her to more trauma. "Cancel my meetings for the week," he told Marcus, "and get our legal team working on this. I want restraining orders against any media outlet that publishes photos of her." The day descended into chaos. Phones rang constantly. Cameras clicked from beyond the property line. Security guards patrolled the perimeter. Through it all, Grayson worked to maintain Ellie's routine, trying to shield her from the storm brewing outside their walls. That evening, after Mrs. Doyle had gone home and the house grew quiet, Grayson retreated to the piano room. He sat in darkness, his shoulders heavy with worry, wondering if he'd made everything worse for Ellie by trying to help her. A small movement caught his attention. Ellie stood in the doorway, her rabbit clutched to her chest. She padded across the room in her sock feet and stopped directly in front of him. Before he could react, she reached out and placed her hand gently over his heart. Her other hand moved in the sign for sad, one of the first words she'd learned. Then she spelled out slowly, "I can hear your sadness." Grayson stared at her, stunned. Her face held such understanding, such genuine concern. Somehow, this child who couldn't hear in the traditional sense perceived emotions as clearly as musical notes, feeling the vibrations of feelings themselves. Without thinking, he shifted on the piano bench, making space for her. His fingers found the keys, and he began to play, not the complex pieces he'd once performed, but a simple, sweet melody his mother had taught him. Ellie placed her small hand flat against the piano's surface, her eyes closing in concentration. The music filled the room, soft and clear. Through the corner of his eye, Grayson saw Ellie's free hand moving, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. She swayed slightly, completely absorbed in the vibrations flowing through the wood into her palm. When the last note faded, Ellie opened her eyes and smiled. That pure, unguarded smile that reminded him so much of his daughter. Something tight in Grayson's chest loosened, and he found himself smiling back. Not the polite smile he used in business meetings or the sad one he wore when looking at old photographs, but a real smile that reached his eyes and warmed his heart. For that moment, the chaos outside ceased to matter. The music had built a bridge between them, creating a language beyond words or signs. In Ellie's unique way of hearing, she'd helped him rediscover something he thought he'd lost forever, the joy of sharing music with someone who truly felt it. But far from the peaceful sanctuary of the piano room, another kind of music was playing. In a dingy apartment across town, Ellie's father sat watching the news reports, his bloodshot eyes growing calculating as dollar signs danced in his head. He reached for his phone, fingers trembling only slightly as he dialed a tabloid's tip line. The story he'd traded away for a bottle was worth far more than he'd realized, and he intended to cash in. The morning sun cast long shadows across Grayson's desk as he sorted through his mail. His fingers paused on a thick legal envelope, the formal letterhead making his stomach tighten. Inside, the document's first paragraph made his blood run cold. Notice of legal action, recustody and allegations of kidnapping, minor child Elena Marie Patterson. Grayson's hands trembled as he read further. Ellie's father had filed a formal complaint, claiming his daughter had been taken against his will while he was temporarily indisposed. The letter painted Grayson as a predator who had exploited a vulnerable man's momentary weakness to steal his child. Mrs. Doyle knocked softly before entering his study. "Mr. Weller, there are 2 police officers at the door. They're asking to speak with you." Grayson straightened his shoulders, tucking the letter into his desk drawer. "Show them in, please, and keep Ellie occupied in the greenhouse for now." The officers, a male and female pair, entered his study with practiced professionalism. Detective Sarah Martinez introduced herself and her partner, Detective James Cooper. Though their tone remained courteous, their eyes held that familiar look of suspicion he'd seen in the tabloids. "Mr. Weller," Detective Martinez began, notebook ready. "We're here to investigate claims made by Ronald Patterson regarding his daughter Elena's current living situation." Grayson recounted that night at the bar with careful precision, describing the father's drunken behavior and cruel words. "I have the signed paper," he added, retrieving it from his safe. "And my lawyer has already begun proper guardianship proceedings." "A piece of paper signed in a bar isn't exactly legal custody, Mr. Weller," Detective Cooper pointed out, his pen scratching across his notepad. "And your unusual method of intervention raises some concerns." "I understand how it looks," Grayson admitted. "But I couldn't leave her there. Her father was—" A commotion in the hallway interrupted him. Ellie burst through the door, her face streaked with tears, Mrs. Doyle hurrying behind her. The girl's eyes darted between the officers' uniforms, and she immediately ran to Grayson, wrapping her arms around his waist. The detectives watched as Grayson instinctively placed a protective hand on her shoulder, the gesture natural and paternal. Ellie's fingers flew in frantic signs, which Grayson now understood well enough to translate. "She's asking if they're going to take her away," he explained quietly. Detective Martinez's expression softened slightly. She knelt to Ellie's eye level and spoke clearly, allowing the girl to read her lips. "No one's taking you anywhere right now, sweetheart. We just need to make sure you're safe." Ellie's grip on Grayson tightened. She pulled out the small notepad she carried and wrote quickly. "I am safe. Please don't send me back." The officers conducted a thorough inspection of the house, interviewed Mrs. Doyle, and took detailed notes about Ellie's care, her new sign language lessons, the child psychologist's visits, her comfortable room filled with art supplies. Before leaving, Detective E. Martinez handed Grayson her card. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Patterson as well," she said, "but I want you to call me immediately if he tries to contact either of you." The moment they left, Grayson was on the phone with his attorney, Jonathan Mills. They met that evening in Grayson's study, the fire crackling as snow began to fall outside. "The situation is complicated but not hopeless," Jonathan explained, spreading documents across the desk. "We can file for emergency temporary guardianship based on documented neglect and endangerment. The signed paper from the bar actually works in our favor. It shows the father's willingness to abandon his parental responsibilities for money." "But will it be enough?" Grayson pressed, pacing near the windows. "You should see how she flinches when anyone mentions him, John. I can't let her go back to that." "The court will consider her wishes, especially given her age and special needs. We'll need testimonies from the child psychologist, her sign language teacher, Mrs. Doyle, anyone who can speak to her well-being here versus her previous situation." Grayson nodded, but anxiety still churned in his stomach. After Jonathan left, he couldn't bring himself to sleep. He sat in the living room's oversized leather chair, watching snow accumulate on the window panes, each flake illuminated by the firelight before melting away. His mind wandered to his daughter Sarah's last winter, building snowmen, making hot chocolate, her laughter echoing through these same rooms. Now a different child's presence filled these spaces, bringing unexpected light back into his life. The thought of losing Ellie too made his chest ache. Soft footsteps padded across the carpet. Ellie appeared in her flannel pajamas, clutching her sketchbook. She must have felt his distress through the floor vibrations again. Her extraordinary sensitivity to emotions never ceased to amaze him. She settled cross-legged on the floor beside his chair and opened her sketchbook. The new drawing showed a house, his house, surrounded by flowing lines that looked like sound waves. Musical notes floated in the air around it, but instead of being black, they were filled with warm colors: gold, rose, soft purple. Below the drawing, she'd written in her improving handwriting, "This is what I hear when you smile." Grayson stared at the image, his throat tight with emotion. Somehow, this child who lived in relative silence understood joy better than most people with perfect hearing. She perceived happiness as colors and vibrations, teaching him to experience his own emotions in a new way. He picked up the pad of paper they kept nearby for conversations and wrote, "Your drawings help me hear better too. Ellie beamed at him, then reached for her colored pencils. Together they sat by the fire, adding more colors to her sound waves while the snow fell silently outside. The fear wasn't gone. The legal battle ahead would be difficult, but something else had taken root alongside it. Hope, Grayson realized. This was what hope felt like. Not the desperate kind that ended in disappointment, but the quiet certainty that some things were worth fighting for. He watched Ellie shade another musical note in brilliant yellow, her face peaceful in the firelight, and knew he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The morning after the police visit, Grayson sat at his desk, searching for answers. His fingers moved across his keyboard, researching hearing impairment and ways to better communicate with Ellie. A notification popped up, an email from Dr. Sarah Chen, a renowned music therapist who specialized in working with deaf children. "Music isn't just about hearing," she wrote. "It's about feeling. The vibrations, the resonance. They tell stories our ears sometimes miss." Grayson leaned back in his chair, remembering how Ellie pressed her hands against the piano. He made the appointment immediately. 3 days later, they drove to Dr. Chen's studio in downtown Aspen. The space was filled with instruments, not just traditional ones, but also specialized equipment designed to translate sound into physical sensation. Wooden floors and panels lined the walls, engineered to conduct vibrations perfectly. "Welcome, Ellie," Dr. Chen signed, her movements graceful and precise. She was a petite woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "Would you like to feel some music today?" Ellie nodded eagerly, her earlier nervousness melting away. Dr. Chen led her to a special platform connected to speakers underneath. "This will help you feel the music through your whole body," she explained through signs and written words, like standing in an ocean of sound. Grayson watched as Dr. Chen played different instruments, each creating unique vibration patterns Ellie could feel through the platform. The girl's face lit up with each new sensation. She moved her hands through the air as if she could catch the sound waves. "Mr. Weller." Dr. Chen turned to him. "Would you play something on the piano? Sometimes familiar sources create the strongest connections." Grayson hesitated. He hadn't touched a piano in front of others since losing his family. But Ellie looked at him with such trust, he couldn't refuse. He sat at the sleek, grand piano while Dr. Chen helped Ellie position herself where she could feel the maximum resonance. His fingers found the keys, playing a simple melody he used to practice with his daughter. The notes felt rusty at first, but muscle memory took over. He watched Ellie's expression change as she absorbed the vibrations through her feet and hands, which she had pressed against the piano's side. When he finished, she grabbed her notepad excitedly. "It feels like sunshine dancing," she wrote, drawing quick squiggles to show the movement of the sound. Dr. Chen smiled. Music therapy can help Ellie develop a deeper understanding of sound through touch and vibration. It's also wonderful for emotional expression and connection. They scheduled regular sessions, and Dr. Chen recommended ways to enhance Ellie's experience at home. She suggested special floor panels near the piano and showed Grayson how to adjust his playing to create stronger resonance. Back at the mansion, Grayson had the recommended modifications installed immediately. He began playing more frequently, watching how Ellie responded to different pieces. She would sit for hours, sometimes on the floor, sometimes with her hands on the piano itself, absorbing the music in her unique way. One stormy evening, thunder rolled across the mountains, making the windows vibrate. Ellie, instead of being frightened, seemed fascinated by the natural percussion. She sat near the piano, feeling the storm's rhythm through the floorboards. Grayson was struck by an idea. He sat at the piano and began playing a lullaby he'd composed years ago for Sarah. The melody wove together with the thunder, creating a duet between man and nature. Lightning flickered through the windows, illuminating Ellie's face as she sat with her eyes closed, one hand pressed to the floor. The piece was gentle but full of emotion. All the love he'd felt for his daughter, all the grief of losing her, and now, somehow, the hope that Ellie had brought back into his life. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, letting the music say what words couldn't. When the final notes faded away, something extraordinary happened. In the quiet between thunderclaps, a small voice broke the silence. "I heard you, Mr. Weller." The words were soft, slightly unclear, the voice of someone who couldn't hear their own speech, but unmistakable. Grayson turned, stunned. Ellie was looking at him with tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. He knelt beside her, his own eyes wet. She reached out and touched his chest, right over his heart, then made the sign for music, followed by love. In that moment, Grayson understood what Dr. Chen had meant about music being more than just sound. Ellie might not hear in the conventional way, but she perceived the emotional vibrations of life with extraordinary clarity. She heard with her heart, with her soul, perhaps more deeply than many people with perfect hearing ever would. He pulled her into a gentle hug, feeling her small hands press against his back, probably sensing his rapid heartbeat. The storm continued outside, but in here, in this moment, they had found a different kind of music, the rhythm of two hearts healing together. When they separated, Ellie picked up her ever-present notepad and wrote, "Your song feels like a hug sounds." She paused, then added, "Can you teach me to play?" Grayson nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in his throat. He helped her onto the piano bench beside him and gently placed her hands on the keys. Together, they began to explore this new language they shared, one that didn't need words or even conventional hearing to be understood. Outside, the storm began to fade, but its energy had transformed into something beautiful. The sound of barriers breaking down, of connection growing stronger, of music finding new ways to be heard. In teaching Ellie to feel the music, Grayson was learning to truly hear again himself. The morning after Ellie first spoke, Grayson found her sitting cross-legged on the music room floor, surrounded by paper and colored pencils. Her hands moved quickly, creating sweeping lines of yellow and orange that seemed to dance across the page. "What are you drawing?" he asked, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear him. But Ellie sensed his presence through the vibrations of his footsteps and looked up with a bright smile. She held up her drawing proudly. It was an explosion of warm colors, swirling together like a sunset caught in motion. On the bottom, she had written, "This is how your lullaby feels." Grayson's throat tightened with emotion. He sat down beside her, picking up one of her other drawings, this one in blues and silvers. "Thunder," he wrote on her notepad. She nodded enthusiastically, then made a rolling motion with her hands before reaching for more colors. Mrs. Doyle found them like that an hour later, the floor covered in Ellie's artistic interpretations of sound. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. "These are beautiful!" Grayson looked up at his housekeeper. "She needs a proper place to work," he said thoughtfully. The light in the spare room upstairs would be perfect for an art studio. Within days, the unused guest room was transformed. Grayson ordered professional-grade art supplies, easels, canvases, paints in every color imaginable. He installed special lighting and covered the hardwood floors with drop cloths. When he showed Ellie her new studio, her eyes grew wide with wonder. She immediately got to work, attacking a large canvas with bold strokes. This time, she painted what she felt when Max, the golden retriever, barked, warm browns and playful splashes of yellow. Mrs. Doyle watched from the doorway, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. "This one's going in the hall," she declared when it was finished. "Right where everyone can see it." True to her word, Mrs. Doyle hung the painting in a prominent spot near the main staircase. It was the first new piece of art to grace the mansion's walls since Grayson's family passed away. As Ellie created more paintings, each one expressing how she experienced different sounds and emotions, Mrs. Doyle started posting photos of them on her personal social media account. "My sweet girl paints what she hears with her heart," she captioned one image. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People were captivated by the idea of a deaf child translating sound into visual art. The posts went viral, shared thousands of times. Soon, local news stations were calling, requesting interviews. Grayson was protective at first, hesitant to expose Ellie to public attention. But when he saw how proudly she showed off her work, how her confidence grew with each positive comment, he carefully agreed to limited media coverage. A thoughtful article in the local paper led to a feature in a national magazine. "The Girl Who Paints Sound: How Art Transcends Disability" brought attention to Grayson's foundation, which he had quietly established to support children with sensory impairments. Donations began pouring in. People were moved not just by Ellie's art, but by the story of the reclusive billionaire who had opened his heart and home to a child in need. The cold, distant image Grayson had cultivated since his family's death began to thaw in the public eye. One afternoon, while Ellie worked on a new painting, this one inspired by the sound of rain on the greenhouse roof, Mrs. Doyle found Grayson standing in the doorway, his expression troubled. "What's weighing on you?" she asked softly. He led her to his study, closing the door before speaking. "Sometimes," he admitted. "When I watch her paint, when I see her laugh, she reminds me so much of Sarah." His voice cracked. The way she scrunches her nose when she concentrates, how she gets totally lost in her art, just like Sarah used to do with her drawings. Mrs. Doyle waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. "It scares me, Margaret," he continued. "I couldn't protect Sarah. What if I fail Ellie too?" "Oh, my dear boy," Mrs. Doyle said gently. "Loving again isn't betraying Sarah's memory. It's honoring it. You're giving another child the same love you gave her. That's a beautiful thing." That evening, as Grayson tucked Ellie into bed, something that had become their nightly ritual, she caught his hand before he could leave. In the soft lamplight, her fingers moved deliberately, forming signs they'd been practicing together. "You were her daddy," she signed carefully. "You can be mine too." Grayson stood frozen, tears welling in his eyes. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. Ellie reached up and touched his cheek, wiping away a tear with her small finger. Then she smiled, that pure, accepting smile that had begun to heal his broken heart, and snuggled down into her covers. He managed to make it to the hallway before the tears really started falling. There, in the dimness, he found himself face to face with Sarah's painting of sound, browns and yellows swirling together, full of life and joy. His daughter's memory and this new child's presence seemed to merge in that moment, not competing, but complementing each other, like different instruments creating perfect harmony. Grayson sat in his dimly lit study, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and background reports. The soft glow of his laptop cast shadows across his tired face as he delved deeper into Ellie's history. His legal team had been thorough, gathering every scrap of information about her past and her father's descent into alcoholism. Mrs. Doyle brought him a fresh cup of coffee, tutting at the dark circles under his eyes. "You need rest, Mr. Weller." "I can't," he said, rubbing his temples. "The temporary guardianship hearing is coming up. I need to be prepared for anything her father might throw at us." He scrolled through another police report, noting the frequent mentions of a particular name: Tom Reeves. This man appeared repeatedly in incident reports involving Ellie's father: bar fights, drunk driving citations, disorderly conduct. Tom seemed to be the constant enabler, the drinking buddy who'd encouraged Ellie's father's downward spiral. Something about the name nagged at him. Grayson opened another file, this one from 5 years ago. His hands began to shake as he read the accident report from the night his family died. The drunk driver's name jumped off the page, Thomas J. Reeves. The coffee cup slipped from his grasp, shattering on the hardwood floor. Mrs. Doyle rushed back in, but Grayson barely noticed her presence. His mind reeled with the cruel connection. The man who had destroyed his family had gone on to help destroy Ellie's. "My God," he whispered, pushing back from his desk. "It's all connected." Mrs. Doyle bent to clean up the broken cup, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong?" Grayson explained the discovery, his voice hollow. "Tom Reeves killed Sarah and Claire. Then he befriended Ellie's father, probably in some 12-step program he never completed. He helped turn that man into the same kind of monster he was." Mrs. Doyle straightened, her face pale. "Does Ellie know any of this?" "No," Grayson said firmly. "And she can't. She's been through enough trauma. This would only hurt her more." But the knowledge weighed heavily on him. That night, he couldn't sleep, pacing the halls of his mansion. The guilt felt overwhelming. If he'd reached out to Tom Reeves's victims sooner, could he have prevented Ellie's suffering? Should he have done more to help families affected by drunk driving instead of retreating into his grief? He found himself in the music room, sitting at the piano but not playing. Ellie appeared in the doorway, barefoot in her pajamas, concern written on her face. She could always sense when he was troubled. She padded over and placed her hand on the piano's surface, then looked at him expectantly. Despite his turmoil, Grayson managed a small smile and began to play softly. Ellie closed her eyes, feeling the vibrations through her fingertips. The weekend arrived, bringing with it the community outreach event they'd been planning for weeks. The local arts center had organized a special performance to showcase the intersection of music and visual art, featuring Grayson and Ellie. Backstage, Grayson helped Ellie set up her easel and paints. She wore a pretty blue dress that Mrs. Doyle had picked out, her hair neatly braided. Her excitement was palpable as she arranged her colors just so. The auditorium filled quickly. Word had spread about the unique performance, drawing curious spectators from across the region. As the lights dimmed, Grayson took his place at the grand piano, while Ellie stood before her blank canvas. He began to play, a piece he'd composed specifically for this moment. It started gently, like morning light breaking through clouds, then built gradually in complexity and emotion. Ellie's brush moved in perfect synchronization with the music, creating sweeping arcs of color that seemed to capture the very essence of each note. As the piece progressed, Grayson wove in themes from classical compositions, each one inspiring new bursts of color on Ellie's canvas. Blues and purples swirled together during a passage from Beethoven, while bright yellows and oranges exploded across the canvas during a Mozart segment. The audience sat spellbound, watching art and music merge in real time. Some wiped away tears as they witnessed the pure joy on Ellie's face as she painted, the way she seemed to dance with her brush, the beautiful connection between guardian and child. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of absolute silence before the audience erupted in applause. Ellie turned to face them, paint splattered and beaming. Grayson crossed the stage to stand beside her, and together they took a bow. The standing ovation continued as they made their way backstage, both still riding high on the emotional performance. Mrs. Doyle was waiting with happy tears in her eyes, ready to engulf Ellie in a proud hug. But their celebration was cut short by the appearance of a woman in a pressed suit, carrying a leather portfolio. She introduced herself as Patricia Martinez, from Child Protective Services. "Mr. Weller," she said, her expression professionally neutral. "I hate to interrupt, but I needed to deliver this notice in person." She handed him an official-looking document. "The custody hearing has been scheduled for next week. Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. sharp." The joy drained from Grayson's face as he read the paper. Ellie, sensing the change in mood, pressed closer to his side. She might not have heard the words, but she understood their impact from his reaction. Mrs. Doyle quickly guided Ellie away to help her clean up her paints, leaving Grayson to speak with the social worker. "Ms. Martinez," he said quietly, "surely you can see that Ellie is thriving here. The progress she's made, the way she's expressing herself." "I can see that," Patricia admitted, "and it will all be taken into consideration. But her father has filed for reinstatement of custody, claiming he's completed a rehabilitation program. The court has to hear both sides." Grayson wanted to scream about Tom Reeves, about the tragic connection between their families, about the injustice of it all. But he held his tongue, knowing an emotional outburst wouldn't help their case. Instead, he watched Ellie across the room, happily showing Mrs. Doyle the details of her painting, completely unaware that her world might be about to change again. The weight of his recent discovery pressed down on him like a physical force. He had failed to protect his family once before. He wouldn't fail Ellie too. "We'll be there," he told Patricia firmly, "with every piece of evidence showing why Ellie belongs here, with people who understand and love her." As the social worker left, Ellie returned to his side, her small hand slipping into his. She looked up at him questioningly, and he squeezed her hand in reassurance. Despite his inner turmoil, he managed to smile down at her, determined not to let her see his fear. She touched his chest, right over his heart, and then signed, "Your music is worried." Even now she could feel the discord in his emotions, the trembling uncertainty beneath his calm exterior. Grayson knelt down to her level, taking both her hands in his. "Everything will be okay," he signed, trying to believe it himself. "I promise." But as they gathered their things to head home, the custody hearing notice felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket, and the ghost of Tom Reeves's influence haunted his thoughts. The cruelty of fate had woven their lives together in the most painful way possible, and now Grayson had to find a way to break that tragic pattern, for Ellie's sake, and for his own. The courthouse loomed before them, its granite facade cold and imposing in the morning light. Grayson held Ellie's trembling hand as they climbed the wide steps, Mrs. Doyle following close behind them. The girl's other hand clutched a folder containing her artwork, pieces that showed her journey from darkness to light, her silent voice made visible through color and form. Inside, the polished marble halls echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations. Grayson's lawyer, Sarah Bennett, met them at the courtroom doors, her expression carefully neutral. "Remember," she said quietly, "let me do the talking. The judge needs to see facts, not emotions." But emotions filled the air like static electricity as they entered courtroom 3. The wooden pews were mostly empty except for a few reporters and social workers. And there, on the opposite side of the aisle, sat Tom Reeves. Grayson almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the disheveled drunk from the bar, replaced by a man in a pressed suit, his hair neatly combed, his hands steady. He looked normal, respectable. The sight made Grayson's stomach turn. Ellie saw her father and pressed closer to Grayson's side, her fingers digging into his arm. He could feel her rapid breathing, the slight tremor running through her small frame. Mrs. Doyle reached forward from the bench behind them and squeezed her shoulder in silent support. "All rise," called the bailiff, and Judge Martha Wilson entered, her black robes sweeping behind her as she took her place at the bench. Her face was lined with experience, her grey hair pulled back severely, but her eyes were kind as they swept over the courtroom. "Be seated," she said, shuffling through the papers before her. "We're here today to determine custody arrangements for Eleanor Marie Reeves, age 13. I've reviewed the preliminary documents from both parties." She looked up, first at Tom Reeves, then at Grayson. This is an unusual case, to say the least. Tom Reeves's lawyer stood first, a younger man with eager eyes and a practiced smile. "Your Honor, my client has completed a 60-day rehabilitation program and maintained sobriety for 3 months. He acknowledges his past mistakes and seeks only to reunite with his daughter, to rebuild their relationship in a healthy environment." Tom Reeves stood when prompted, his voice steady and clear. "I know I failed my daughter," he said, and to Grayson's surprise, tears gleamed in the man's eyes. "The drinking. It took over after my wife died. I couldn't cope. But I'm different now. I'm sober. I have a job lined up, a new apartment. I just want a chance to be the father Ellie deserves." Grayson felt Ellie's grip tighten at the sound of her father's voice. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language, see the performance being put on for the court. Sarah Bennett rose next, her presence commanding attention. "Your Honor, while we commend Mr. Reeves's efforts at rehabilitation, 3 months of sobriety cannot erase years of documented neglect and emotional abuse. Mr. Weller has provided Ellie with stability, education, and specialized care for her hearing impairment. She's flourishing in his care." She presented evidence methodically. Medical records showing untreated ear infections that had contributed to Ellie's hearing loss, school reports of frequent absences, police reports from domestic disturbance calls. Then came the positive evidence. Ellie's progress reports from her sign language tutor, evaluations from her art therapist, glowing notes from her new teachers at the private school for hearing-impaired students. Furthermore, Sarah continued, Mr. Weller has established a foundation for children with sensory impairments inspired by Ellie's artistic talents. She's not just surviving in his care, she's thriving and helping others. Judge Wilson listened intently, occasionally making notes. When both sides had presented their cases, she called Ellie forward to speak with her privately in chambers. Grayson watched helplessly as Ellie walked away, her steps hesitant, her shoulders hunched. The minutes stretched like hours. When Ellie finally emerged, her eyes were red, but she held herself straight. The judge followed, her expression grave. "This court's primary concern is the welfare of the child," Judge Wilson began. "While Mr. Weller has provided exemplary care, the law generally favors biological parents when they demonstrate genuine reform and commitment to change." She paused, looking directly at Tom Reeves. "Mr. Reeves, you will be granted temporary custody, pending quarterly reviews over the next year." The words hit Grayson like physical blows. Beside him, Ellie began to shake. "However," the judge continued, "this custody will be highly supervised. You must maintain sobriety, attend parenting classes, and ensure Ellie continues her current educational and therapeutic programs. Any violation will result in immediate review." Ellie's cry of distress cut through the formal atmosphere like a knife. She turned to Grayson, her hands flying in desperate signs. "Please don't let them take me. Please, please, please." The bailiff moved forward as Tom Reeves stood, ready to collect his daughter. Ellie's fingers clutched Grayson's coat, twisting the expensive fabric as tears streamed down her face. Mrs. Doyle was crying too, her prayers barely whispered, but fierce. "It's time, Miss Reeves," the bailiff said gently, reaching for her arm. Grayson wanted to fight, to gather Ellie in his arms and run, but he couldn't. The law was the law, and any resistance would only make things worse. With breaking heart, he carefully untangled Ellie's fingers from his coat. "I love you," he signed to her. "Stay strong. This isn't over." They all watched, helpless as Ellie was led away, her small figure disappearing through the courtroom doors with her father. The sound of her sobs echoed in the hallway, growing fainter until silence fell like a shroud. The drive home was endless. Mrs. Doyle sat in the back seat, her rosary beads clicking softly as she prayed. Grayson gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, fighting to maintain control. When they reached the mansion, its grand rooms felt hollow, every corner haunted by Ellie's absence. Her art supplies still lay scattered in the studio. Her half-finished breakfast sat on the kitchen counter where she'd left it that morning, too nervous to eat. Max met them at the door, tail wagging, looking behind them for Ellie. When she didn't appear, he whined, padding from room to room, searching for her. Grayson found himself in the music room as evening fell, sitting before the piano where he and Ellie had shared so many moments. His fingers rested on the keys, but no music came. How could it when the heart had been torn from his home? Mrs. Doyle's voice drifted from the kitchen, where she knelt in her usual spot by the window, praying with fierce determination. "Lord, watch over that child, protect her, bring her back to us." Outside, snow began to fall, thick white flakes swirling in the gathering darkness. Grayson watched them, remembering another snowy night when fate had led him to a run-down bar and a silent girl in need of saving. The same snow that had witnessed their beginning now mocked their separation. Max settled at his feet with another whine, resting his head on Grayson's shoe. Together they sat in the growing darkness, watching the snow fall, while somewhere in the city, a little girl who could feel music in her soul cried herself to sleep in a strange bed, far from the only real home she'd ever known. The mansion felt like a tomb in the days following the custody hearing. Grayson moved through its spacious rooms like a ghost, touching things Ellie had left behind. A half-finished drawing on the kitchen counter, her favorite mug still sitting in the dish rack, a hair ribbon forgotten on the piano bench. Each item was a reminder of the life that had briefly brought warmth back to his cold home. Mrs. Doyle tried to maintain their usual routines, but even she couldn't hide her sadness. She would catch herself setting 3 places at the table instead of 2, then quietly remove the extra plate while blinking back tears. Max, the golden retriever, spent hours lying by the front door, his eyes fixed hopefully on the entrance, waiting for the little girl who always snuck him extra treats. "Mr. Weller," his assistant Sarah called from the doorway of his home office. "The Foundation's Gala Committee needs your approval for next month's event. They're suggesting we showcase some of Ellie's artwork as the centerpiece." "Cancel it," Grayson said, not looking up from his desk where he sat staring at nothing. "All of it." "But sir, we've already sold hundreds of tickets. The press coverage alone would—" "I said cancel it." His voice was quiet but firm. "There's nothing to celebrate." Sarah hesitated, clutching her tablet. "The children we help through the foundation might disagree. They still need— Just handle it." Grayson cut her off, turning to face the window where snow continued to fall, day after day, as if nature itself was in mourning. Letters began arriving by the dozens, then hundreds. People who had followed Ellie's story online, who had been touched by the videos of her painting while Grayson played piano, who had been inspired by her unique way of experiencing music. They all wrote to express their support and concern. "Dear Mr. Weller," one letter began, "my daughter is hearing impaired like Ellie. Watching her paint sound gave us hope. Your foundation's work has changed lives. Please don't give up. Praying for Ellie's return." The letters piled up, unopened, on his desk. Mrs. Doyle would sort through them each evening, reading a few aloud as she dusted his office. But Grayson barely listened. What good were other people's words when the one voice he longed to hear was gone? One particularly cold evening, as Grayson sat in the darkness of the music room, his fingers hovering over the silent piano keys, Mrs. Doyle knocked softly at the door. "This came in today's mail," she said, holding out a small, padded envelope. "It's from Cedar Grove. That's where Ellie's staying." Grayson's hands trembled slightly as he took the package. The address was written in unfamiliar adult handwriting, but inside he found a letter in Ellie's distinctive scrawl, the letters uneven but determined. "Dear Mr. Weller," he read aloud, his voice rough with emotion. "You told me once that sound lives in the soul. I didn't understand then, but I do now. Even when I can't feel the piano's vibrations, I can still hear the music in my heart. You taught me that. I can still hear you." Mrs. Doyle wiped her eyes with her apron as Grayson removed a small flash drive from the envelope. He walked quickly to his office, Mrs. Doyle following close behind. His computer seemed to take forever to boot up, each second an eternity as he waited to see what Ellie had sent. The flash drive contained a single video file. When he clicked play, the screen showed a slightly shaky image of Ellie sitting at what appeared to be a school desk. She was thinner than he remembered, her eyes tired, but there was still that fierce determination in her expression that had first caught his attention in that dingy bar. She looked directly at the camera and spoke, her voice soft and somewhat unclear, but unmistakable. "Don't stop listening." Grayson pressed his hand to his mouth, tears blurring his vision as the short video ended. Mrs. Doyle's hand gripped his shoulder, her own tears falling freely. "That brave little soul," she whispered. "Even now, she's teaching us about faith." Grayson replayed the video again and again, each time feeling the weight in his chest both lighten and deepen. Ellie's voice, however imperfect, rang with the same pure truth as her artwork, a reminder that some connections transcended physical presence. Max padded into the office and laid his head on Grayson's knee, sensing his master's emotional state. The dog's warm presence was comforting, a reminder of the ways love could be expressed without words. "She hasn't given up," Mrs. Doyle said softly. "And neither should we." Grayson reached for his phone, determination replacing the despair that had paralyzed him for days. He dialed his lawyer's number, watching snow fall outside his window as he waited for an answer. Ellie was right. Sound lived in the soul, and her message had awakened something in his that refused to remain silent any longer. The 3 words she spoke in the video echoed in his mind. "Don't stop listening." She hadn't just been asking him to hear her voice, she was reminding him to keep his heart open to hope, to possibility, to love. Even separated, she was still teaching him how to truly hear. Morning light pierced through the mountain fog as Grayson's black SUV wound its way down familiar roads. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. The same route he'd driven that fateful night weeks ago now felt different, heavier with purpose, weighted with memory. The neon bar that had once glowed like an angry wound in the darkness stood silent now. Plywood sheets covered its windows, and a closed sign hung crookedly on the door. Yellow police tape fluttered in the crisp morning breeze, evidence of recent trouble. Grayson couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at its closure, even as he remembered Ellie huddled in that dark corner. He pulled into the parking lot of St. Michael's Church, a modest brick building with a weather-worn steeple. The sign out front read, "AA meeting 9:00 a.m., all welcome." His watch showed 8:45. Early, but he needed these quiet moments to steady himself. Inside, metal folding chairs formed a circle in the church basement. The air smelled of coffee and stale donuts. A few early arrivals milled about, clutching styrofoam cups and speaking in hushed tones. They glanced at him curiously, his expensive coat and careful posture marking him as an outsider. Then he saw him, Jack Morton, Ellie's father. The man looked smaller somehow, without the false bravado alcohol had given him. His clothes were clean but worn, his face unshaven. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. When their eyes met, Jack's widened in recognition and fear. "Mr. Weller," Jack said, his voice rough. I wasn't expecting. Could we talk?" Grayson kept his voice neutral, though his heart hammered. "Outside, perhaps?" Jack nodded, following Grayson up the basement stairs and out to a small garden beside the church. Morning frost still clung to the dormant rose bushes. They sat on a cold stone bench, neither speaking for several long moments. "How is she?" Jack finally asked, staring at his hands. "Ellie, before the court." "She was healing," Grayson said, unable to keep the edge from his voice, learning to trust again, to speak, to create beauty from pain. Jack's shoulders hunched, as if each word was a physical blow. "I know I've failed her, failed as a father. Since her mother died, I just chose the bottle instead," Grayson finished sharply. Then he took a deep breath, remembering why he'd come. "I hated you, still do in many ways. Not just for what you did to Ellie, but because men like you, drunk, reckless, selfish, they took everything from me." Jack looked up, confusion clear on his face. 5 years ago. Grayson continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "A drunk driver killed my wife and daughter. Sophie was just about Ellie's age. When I found your daughter in that bar, it was like seeing a ghost. Or maybe a second chance." Tears began rolling down Jack's cheeks. "I didn't know. God, I'm so sorry. For everything. I keep trying to get clean, to be better. But it's so hard. The cravings, the shame, it's like drowning. And now I've lost her too." Grayson watched a cardinal land on one of the frozen rose bushes, its red feathers bright against the grey morning. "I came here today because I realized something. Hatred is like alcohol. It promises relief but delivers poison. It doesn't heal anything." He turned to face Jack fully. "I want to help you get real treatment. Not just these meetings, though they're important, but proper rehabilitation, counseling, job training, whatever it takes. Not for my sake or even yours, but for Ellie. She deserves a father who can be present, who can heal." Jack wiped his face with shaking hands. "Why would you do that? After everything—" "Because Ellie taught me that some things are more important than being right or holding on to anger. She can feel emotions like music. Did you know that? She showed me that even silence can sing if you listen with your heart." Grayson reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. "I'm starting something new, the Haven of Second Chances. It's going to be a recovery center, focused on parents fighting addiction. Real support, real tools for change. The paperwork's already in motion." Jack took the card reverently, as if it might crumble in his hands. "I want to change, I do, but I'm scared I'll fail again. I always fail." "Probably," Grayson said bluntly. "Recovery isn't a straight line, but this time you'll have support. Real support. And a reason to keep trying." They sat in silence for a while, watching their breath fog in the cold air. Finally, Jack extended his hand. "Thank you. I don't deserve this chance, but I want to try. For Ellie." Grayson shook it firmly. "That's all anyone can do. Try." Over the next few weeks, Grayson threw himself into establishing the Haven. He purchased an old resort property outside town, hiring contractors to renovate it into a state-of-the-art facility. Jack was one of the first residents, showing real commitment initially. But addiction's grip proved strong. 3 weeks into the program, Jack disappeared during a weekend pass. They found him 2 days later in a motel room, surrounded by empty bottles. The relapse hit Grayson hard, not because it was unexpected, but because he'd begun to hope. Yet as he stood in the hospital room where Jack was recovering, Grayson refused to give up. He remembered Ellie's words, "Don't stop listening." Perhaps that meant listening even when the song was difficult, when the melody faltered and broke. "We'll try again," he told Jack's unconscious form. "As many times as it takes, because that's what fathers do. They keep trying, keep fighting, keep loving. And somewhere in all this mess, there's grace enough for both of us to learn how." Outside the hospital window, snow began to fall again, each flake a silent promise that even the coldest seasons eventually yield to spring. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear, painting the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and amber. Grayson Weller sat in his home office, reviewing foundation documents, when his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed his lawyer's number. "Mr. Weller." The attorney's voice was urgent. "There's been an incident involving Jack Thompson, Ellie's father." Grayson's hand tightened on the phone. "What happened?" "He was arrested last night. Assault charges. He got drunk at a local bar and started a fight that put 2 men in the hospital. Given his history and the severity of the injuries, he's looking at significant jail time." The news hit Grayson like a physical blow. Despite everything, the rehabilitation, attempts, the counseling, the support, Jack had fallen again. This time harder than before. "The court has scheduled an emergency custody hearing." His lawyer continued. "This Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning. Given the circumstances, we have a strong case for permanent guardianship." Grayson closed his eyes, thinking of Ellie. These past months without her had been hollow, even as he'd thrown himself into building the Haven and supporting Jack's recovery attempts. Every time he passed her empty art studio or saw her abandoned easel, his heart ached. "What do we need to do?" he asked. "I've already started preparing the paperwork. We'll present evidence of your positive influence on Ellie's life, her artistic development, emotional growth, educational progress, plus documentation of Jack's continued struggles with alcohol and this latest violent incident." After ending the call, Grayson walked to the music room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dancing across the piano's polished surface. He ran his fingers along the keys, remembering how Ellie would press her hand against the wood to feel the vibrations of each note. Mrs. Doyle found him there an hour later. "I heard about the hearing, Mr. Weller," she said softly. "Should I prepare Ellie's room?" He nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "Yes, and Martha. Could you make those cinnamon rolls she loves? Just in case." The housekeeper's eyes welled up. "Of course, sir. It'll be good to have hope in this house again." The days until the hearing crawled by. Grayson spent them gathering evidence, photographs of Ellie's art exhibitions, news articles about her inspirational story, letters from her tutors praising her progress. Each piece told the story of a child blossoming under love and care. Friday morning arrived with a sky as bright as promise. Grayson dressed carefully in a charcoal suit, his fingers fumbling slightly with his tie. The courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters when he arrived. Word of the hearing had leaked. Inside the courtroom, his lawyer arranged their documentation on the table. "Remember," she whispered, "let the evidence speak for itself. Your dedication to Ellie's welfare is clear in every document." The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Margaret Chen, a woman known for her careful consideration in family court matters, studied the papers before her. "This is a petition for full guardianship of Eleanor Thompson, age 13, currently under temporary custody of her biological father, John Thompson, who is now incarcerated. Mr. Weller, please approach." Grayson stood, his steps measured and calm despite his racing heart. The judge peered at him over her reading glasses. "Mr. Weller, I've reviewed the extensive documentation provided by your counsel. I see evidence of remarkable progress in Eleanor's development during her time in your care. Her art therapist notes significant emotional growth. Her tutors report academic improvement. Even her medical records show better overall health. She paused, shuffling through papers. I'm particularly moved by these paintings, her visual interpretations of sound and emotion. Quite extraordinary. Thank you, Your Honor. Grayson replied. Ellie has an incredible gift for translating what she feels into art. She's taught me that hearing happens in many ways, not just with our ears. The judge nodded thoughtfully. And what of your commitment to her future? Running a major corporation must demand significant time. Since Ellie came into my life, I've restructured my work schedule to be more present. My company's philanthropic foundation now focuses on supporting children with sensory challenges inspired by her journey. She's not an obligation, Your Honor. She's family. The courthouse doors opened quietly, and Grayson turned to see Ellie being led in by her social worker. She looked smaller than he remembered, wearing a blue dress and clutching her ever-present sketchbook. Their eyes met across the room, and her face lit up with hope. Judge Chen spoke again, her voice gentle. Eleanor, would you like to share your thoughts with the court? Ellie nodded and walked forward. Her hands moved in confident signs while her social worker interpreted. Mr. Weller taught me that silence isn't empty. He showed me how to turn my differences into something beautiful. With him, I'm not broken. I'm just different. And different can be wonderful. The judge studied Ellie's face carefully. And your father? Do you have anything to say about him? Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she signed. I love my dad, but love isn't enough when someone keeps choosing bottles over you. Mr. Weller chose me every day, even when it was hard. Tears glistened in several eyes around the courtroom. The judge removed her glasses, wiping them slowly with a cloth as she considered. The silence stretched like a held breath. Finally, she spoke. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I find it in the best interest of Eleanor Thompson to grant full legal guardianship to Grayson Weller. She smiled warmly. Mr. Weller has demonstrated not only the financial means to provide for Eleanor, but, more importantly, the emotional capacity to nurture her unique gifts and needs. The words barely registered before Ellie was running across the courtroom, her feet barely touching the ground. She crashed into Grayson's arms with the force of years of longing, her small body shaking with sobs of joy. He lifted her up, holding her close as his own tears fell freely. She pulled back just enough to sign, her movements quick and emotional. You heard me, didn't you? Grayson nodded, his voice rough with feeling. Yes, sweetheart, I finally did. He brushed her hair back from her face. I hear you with my heart now, just like you taught me. Around them, the courtroom erupted in soft applause. Even the normally stoic bailiff dabbed at his eyes. Judge Chen watched from the bench, a tender smile on her face as she discreetly wiped away her own tears. Mrs. Doyle, who had been sitting quietly in the back row, came forward to embrace them both. Welcome home, dear girl, she whispered, though Ellie couldn't hear the words, but she could feel them in the warmth of the housekeeper's arms, in the joy radiating from everyone around her. Grayson kept one arm around Ellie as they signed the final paperwork. Each signature felt like writing a new chapter in their shared story. No longer just a man who bought a girl's freedom in a dingy bar, but a father who had learned to listen with his soul, and a daughter who had taught him how to hear love's quiet song. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright autumn morning, Ellie's hand firmly in his, Grayson realized that sometimes the deepest truths come wrapped in silence, waiting for hearts brave enough to hear them. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the open French doors of Grayson's mansion. 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse decision, and the house hummed with activity as volunteers hung streamers and arranged chairs for the Foundation's grand reopening gala. Ellie stood in the center of the great room, directing helpers with confident gestures as they positioned her paintings along the walls. Each canvas told a story of sound translated into color: sunset oranges for laughter, deep blues for sadness, golden spirals for piano notes. Her latest work stood covered on an easel near the grand piano, waiting for tonight's live performance. Mrs. Doyle bustled through with trays of hors d'oeuvres, pausing to straighten Ellie's collar. "Look at you, taking charge like a proper young lady," she said, signing along with her words as she'd learned to do. Ellie beamed at the praise, her hands moving quickly to suggest more cookies for the dessert table. In his study, Grayson sat at his desk, reviewing the sheet music for his new composition. The sound of forgiveness had flowed from his heart over several late nights, each note carrying the weight of their journey. He heard footsteps and looked up to see a local news crew being escorted in by his assistant. "Mr. Weller," the reporter said warmly, "thank you for allowing us to cover tonight's event. Your story with Ellie has captivated our community. Many are calling it a modern miracle." Grayson smiled, watching through the window as Ellie helped a volunteer hang fairy lights in the garden. "The real miracle," he said, "is how a child's pure heart can teach us to listen with our souls." The afternoon passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Caterers arranged elegant displays while sound technicians tested microphones and lighting. Ellie changed into a flowing blue dress that matched the winter sky, her hair styled with tiny silver clips that caught the light. As guests began arriving, the mansion filled with gentle chatter and soft music. Community leaders, supporters of the arts, and families with special needs, children all gathered in the transformed great room. Ellie moved among them with grace, her tablet ready to type messages when signing wasn't enough. At 8 o'clock sharp, Grayson stepped onto the small stage. The room hushed as he adjusted the microphone. "Welcome," he said, his voice warm with emotion. "Tonight celebrates more than just our Foundation's new mission. It celebrates the power of love to break through any silence." He sat at the piano while Ellie took her place at the easel, fresh paints arranged on her palette. The room held its breath as his fingers touched the keys. The first notes of "The Sound of Forgiveness" filled the air, soft, questioning chords that spoke of loss and loneliness. Ellie's brush moved in perfect synchronization, spreading waves of deep purple across the canvas. As the melody brightened, lifting into a theme of hope, her strokes became more confident. Yellow light seemed to burst from her paintbrush, weaving through the darker colors like sunrise through storm clouds. Grayson played with his eyes closed, letting the music carry his heart's journey. The middle section swelled with complexity, anger and grief tangled with acceptance and healing. Ellie's painting bloomed with corresponding intensity, her small hands dancing across the canvas as if conducting their shared symphony of redemption. The final movement emerged gentle and clear, a melody of pure joy. Golden notes sparkled like light on water as Ellie added finishing touches of bright white that seemed to make the entire painting glow from within. As the last piano notes faded, she stepped back from her completed work. The audience sat in stunned silence for a moment before rising as one, their applause thundering through the room. Tears flowed freely as people turned to embrace their neighbors, moved beyond words by the raw emotion of the performance. Grayson crossed to Ellie and knelt beside her, their eyes meeting in perfect understanding. She threw her arms around his neck as cameras flashed, capturing the moment father and daughter shared their triumph. The painting behind them radiated warmth and light, a visual symphony of their love story. Mrs. Doyle appeared with tissues for those still wiping their eyes. "In all my years," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've never seen anything so beautiful." Looking at Ellie's shining face, Grayson felt the last frozen pieces of his heart melt completely. The rhythm of their new life together beat strong and sure, a melody of faith, forgiveness, and family that no silence could ever diminish. The following morning, golden sunlight streamed through the mansion's tall windows, casting warm patterns across the breakfast table. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of Mrs. Doyle's freshly baked cinnamon rolls and coffee. Grayson sat at the table, watching Ellie spread honey on her toast with careful precision. Max lounged contentedly at their feet, his tail thumping occasionally against the hardwood floor whenever someone dropped a crumb his way. Mrs. Doyle hummed as she worked at the counter, her presence adding to the peaceful morning atmosphere. She'd grown accustomed to signing simple phrases while she spoke, making sure Ellie never felt left out of conversations. Ellie's hand suddenly moved in a series of deliberate gestures that made Grayson pause mid-sip of his coffee. She wanted to visit her father. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Her fingers formed the sign for forgiveness with gentle determination. Grayson's heart swelled with pride and amazement at her strength. Setting down his cup, he signed back, "When you're ready, we'll go together." Mrs. Doyle wiped a tear from her eye, pretending to be very busy with the dishes. After breakfast, they walked into the garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. The morning air carried the sweet scent of lilacs and fresh grass. A light breeze rustled through the trees, bringing with it the sound of distant laughter from children playing in the neighborhood beyond their property. Ellie stopped walking and reached for Grayson's hand. She placed it against his chest, right over his heart, and smiled up at him. Her fingers moved gracefully. "Do you hear that?" Grayson nodded, understanding perfectly what she meant. "Yes." He signed back, "It's everything." It was the sound of healing, of love, of second chances, all the things that couldn't be heard with ears alone. They set up their easels in the garden, side by side. Through the open windows of the mansion, piano music drifted out, a recording of last night's performance. The notes seemed to dance with the butterflies that flitted between the flowers. As they painted together, brushes moving in comfortable synchronization, Grayson understood that this was more than just a happy ending. It was proof that God's grace could bridge any distance, heal any wound, and turn even the deepest silence into a symphony of love. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.